A long oil slick led into the forest. Each tree trunk turned into an open wound, jagged and soaked with sap. No sawing, no wheel marks, just the absolute silence of a crime that had been cleaned up. I walked over the fallen trees, as if walking through a newly built cemetery, but they didn't know. I had buried something else under this layer of soil. They pulled up the roots. I dug up the evidence. For each leaf cut down, I replaced it with a flipped file. They thought I would bow my head. But they forgot that the one who had waited for the forest to grow for 30 years was not afraid of waiting for the day the forest demanded blood. For 15 years, I had been saving up to buy a piece of wooded land. Most of my neighbors assumed I was just a quiet guy. My name was David Mitchell, I was 42, and I had never had to advertise what I did to make a difference. Within 10 minutes of moving in, a kind neighbor warned me about Margaret Sullivan, the 38-year-old HOA president who had taken her landscaping authority to the extreme. That morning, as I stood looking at the ruins of what had once been a lush patch of wooded land on my property, I realized something disturbing. Margaret had no idea who she had just messed with or how costly her mistake would be. That evening, I walked across the street and knocked on Margaret's door. She answered with that same self-satisfied smile, clearly expecting gratitude rather than questions. "Oh, you must be the new owner," she exclaimed, clasping her hands together like she was greeting an old friend. "I thought you'd appreciate us cleaning up that messy woodland area. It was really bringing down the property values for everyone." Her tone was sickeningly sweet, as if she'd done me the greatest favor imaginable. I kept my voice calm and polite. "Actually, I'm curious about who authorized the removal of those trees. They were on my private property." Margaret's smile faltered for just a moment before returning with renewed intensity. "Oh, honey, when you buy in an HOA community, certain sacrifices have to be made for the greater good. Those trees were unsightly and blocked the view for other residents." She disappeared into her house and returned with a photocopied document that was barely legible. "Here's our official HOA regulations," she said, thrusting the papers at me. "According to community standards, I have the authority to modify landscaping that affects the overall neighborhood appearance." The document looked like it had been copied dozens of times, with smudged text and unclear signatures. "I understand you're new to managed communities," Margaret continued, her voice taking on a condescending edge. "But you need to understand that we have rules here. We can't have people turning our beautiful neighborhood into some kind of wilderness preserve." I studied the document carefully, noting several inconsistencies and unclear language. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'd like to review the proper procedures for this kind of decision. Were there community meetings? Fotostaka?" Her laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Mr. Mitchell, I've been managing this community for 3 years. I know what's best for our property values and our residents' quality of life. New homeowners need to understand they're part of something bigger now." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a motherly tone. "My advice? Accept reality and focus on being a good neighbor. Fighting this will only make things difficult for everyone, especially you." 3 days later, the first official warning letter arrived in my mailbox. The HOA was now accusing me of planning unauthorized future plantings and showing an uncooperative attitude toward community standards. The letter was printed on official HOA letterhead and signed with Margaret's flowing signature. I read through the document twice, noting the creative interpretation of rules that didn't seem to exist in any legitimate HOA charter. The letter demanded that I cease all plans for landscape modifications and report to the HOA board for compliance counseling. That same afternoon, I ran into my next-door neighbor Frank while getting my mail. "Hey, David," he said quietly, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "I wanted to apologize for Margaret's behavior. She's been telling everyone you're some kind of troublemaker who wants to turn the neighborhood into a forest." Frank looked genuinely uncomfortable as he continued. "She said you're difficult to work with and clearly don't understand how civilized neighborhoods operate. Some folks are starting to believe her, you know?" I thanked Frank for the heads up and asked him what he knew about the HOA's actual authority. "Honestly," he admitted, "most of us just go along with whatever Margaret says. She's so confident about the rules, and none of us want to get on her bad side." That evening, I made my first round of phone calls to some old colleagues. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, and my professional instincts were telling me to dig deeper. The more questions I asked, the more suspicious I became about Margaret's claimed authority. Exactly 1 week later, a certified letter arrived with a bill that made my blood boil. $2,500 for landscape remediation fees and community aesthetic violation penalties. The itemized invoice claimed charges for professional debris removal, soil restoration, and administrative processing fees. Within an hour of receiving the bill, my phone rang. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Margaret Sullivan. I trust you received our invoice for the cleanup services." Her voice had lost all pretense of friendliness. It was cold, businesslike, and carried an unmistakable tone of authority. "The HOA had to pay for professional cleanup of the debris your unauthorized trees created," she explained. "Violations of community standards come with mandatory fines." "Mrs. Sullivan," I replied carefully, "I haven't authorized any tree removal, and I certainly didn't create any debris. These charges seem completely inappropriate." Her laugh was harsh and condescending. "Mr. Mitchell, living in our HOA means following our rules. The landscape modification was necessary for community standards, and residents are responsible for associated costs." She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering what she clearly considered the killing blow. "If you don't like our policies, you're welcome to move somewhere else. But as long as you live here, you'll pay your share and follow our guidelines." When I refused to pay what I considered an outrageous and illegal fine, Margaret's threats escalated quickly. "Mitchell, I'm going to be very clear with you. This community has operated successfully for years because residents understand their obligations. If you continue this stubborn attitude, we'll pursue stronger legal measures." I began spending my evenings researching property records and boundary surveys, discovering some very interesting discrepancies in the HOA documentation. The more I investigated, the more convinced I became that Margaret had made a very serious mistake. 2 weeks after the financial demands, Margaret organized what she announced as an emergency HOA meeting to address the David Mitchell situation. The notice, delivered to every house in the neighborhood, claimed that urgent community action is required to resolve a resident dispute that threatens our neighborhood harmony. The community center was packed with 43 neighbors, many of whom I'd never met. Margaret stood at the front of the room like a prosecutor preparing to present her case. She'd arranged the chairs in rows facing a small podium, creating an almost courtroom-like atmosphere. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Margaret began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We have a serious situation that requires community attention. Mr. David Mitchell has consistently refused to cooperate with legitimate HOA decisions." She gestured toward me, sitting in the back row, feeling like a defendant at his own trial. "Mr. Mitchell has threatened legal action against our community, shown contempt for our democratic processes, and created a disruptive atmosphere in our peaceful neighborhood." Margaret pulled out a folder thick with papers. "I have documented evidence of his pattern of defiance," she continued, reading from what appeared to be a prepared statement. "Refusal to accept community landscaping decisions, threats against HOA authority, and an attitude of superiority that suggests he believes he's above our established rules." The room was uncomfortably quiet, with most people staring at me expectantly. I could hear whispered comments from various corners. Some people just don't understand community living, and maybe he should have researched the neighborhood before buying. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she sensed the room's support. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm giving you one final opportunity to apologize to this community and commit to following our regulations. Specifically, you must promise never to plant trees higher than 6 feet anywhere on your property." The demand was so absurd that I almost laughed, but the serious faces around me made it clear that Margaret had successfully painted me as the unreasonable party. "This is your chance to show good faith," she continued. "Apologize for disrupting our community and accept your responsibilities as an HOA resident." I sat in that room, surrounded by neighbors who barely knew me, listening to Margaret paint me as some kind of troublemaker, and felt a cold anger settling in my chest. She had no idea what she'd just started. When I remained silent, refusing to apologize for something I hadn't done wrong, Margaret's face hardened with determination. "Very well," she announced to the room. "Mr. Mitchell's silence speaks volumes about his attitude toward this community." She turned to address the full audience, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering an ultimatum. "Since Mr. Mitchell refuses to accept responsibility, the HOA will be forced to pursue legal action. We will file lawsuits for breach of community contract and disturbing the peace." The room buzzed with murmurs of approval and surprise. Margaret raised her hand for silence before continuing. "Furthermore, we will be contacting appropriate government agencies to investigate the legality of Mr. Mitchell's land ownership and ensure he understands the consequences of challenging established authority. Her voice carried the confidence of someone who had never been successfully challenged before. Mr. Mitchell, you have exactly 1 week to publicly apologize, pay your outstanding fines, and commit in writing to following all HOA regulations. She paused dramatically, letting her words hang in the air like a storm cloud. If you fail to comply, this community will take much stronger action against you. We have legal resources, government connections, and the full support of our residents. Several neighbors were nodding in agreement with her hardline approach. I could see that Margaret had successfully positioned herself as the reasonable authority figure dealing with an unreasonable troublemaker. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes watching my every move. I looked directly into Margaret's eyes for the first time since this nightmare began, and for just a moment I saw something flicker across her face, uncertainty, maybe even a hint of concern. My voice was calm and quiet, but it carried clearly across the silent room. Mrs. Sullivan, I believe you've made a very serious mistake, and I'm going to prove it. The room fell completely silent, as Margaret's confident expression faltered just slightly. She had no idea that her campaign of intimidation had just awakened someone who knew exactly how to fight back. I spent the next 48 hours doing what I do best: methodical investigation and documentation. My home office became a war room, with property surveys, legal documents, and environmental regulations spread across every surface. I started with the most basic question: did Margaret actually have the authority she claimed? The first breakthrough came when I examined the actual property surveys and boundary records from the county land office. Margaret's claim that my forest fell under HOA jurisdiction was completely false. The wooded area was 100% private property, clearly marked in all official documents, and fell outside the common landscaping areas defined in the legitimate HOA charter. The photocopied regulations Margaret had shown me were apparently her own creative interpretation of rules that didn't actually exist. The real HOA charter, which I obtained from the county records office, contained no provisions for removing trees from private property without owner consent. My second discovery sent chills down my spine. I cross-referenced the species of trees that had been destroyed with state environmental protection databases. Nearly 40% of the trees were protected native species that required special permits for removal under state environmental laws. Margaret, and whatever tree service she'd hired, had violated multiple Environmental Protection Act regulations. As someone who'd spent 15 years dealing with exactly these types of violations, I knew the penalties could be severe, both financially and potentially criminally. But I wasn't finished digging. I began researching Margaret's background, looking for patterns of behavior or connections that might explain her aggressive tactics. What I discovered would change everything. It was time to reveal something that Margaret Sullivan had no way of knowing. My name is David Mitchell, and for the past 15 years, I've been a federal environmental inspector, specializing in natural resource violations and illegal land use. I'd investigated hundreds of cases exactly like this one, watching powerful people destroy protected environments for profit or convenience. I'd only recently retired from government service to start my own environmental consulting firm, but I still maintained close relationships with every relevant agency and enforcement office. Those trees weren't just a retirement dream. They were part of a long-term ecological research project I'd been planning for 8 years. My phone calls to colleagues had been much more productive than Margaret could have imagined. Within 2 days, I had documentation proving that she'd violated federal environmental protection laws, state tree preservation statutes, and multiple local property rights regulations. Sarah Martinez, a property rights attorney who'd been my colleague during several major environmental cases, confirmed what I already suspected. David, this is a textbook case of abuse of authority, violation of private property rights, and environmental law violations. The damages could easily reach $50,000 to $80,000, not counting potential criminal charges. I also contacted Michael Rodriguez, a certified arborist and tree valuation expert who'd worked with me on dozens of environmental damage assessments. After surveying the destruction and reviewing the photographs I'd taken before the cutting, he calculated total damages at $78,500, including replacement costs and the time required for ecological recovery. But building a legal case was only part of my strategy. I was also building something much more valuable: a network of allies who were just as angry about this situation as I was. The first unexpected ally emerged from the most unlikely source: Margaret's own household. I'd noticed James Sullivan working on his car several evenings in a row, and something about his body language suggested frustration that went beyond automotive problems. During a casual conversation while he was changing his oil, James revealed information that stunned me. "I've been growing frustrated with Margaret's dictatorial approach to HOA management," he admitted, glancing nervously toward his house. "She makes major decisions without consulting anyone, including me." James looked genuinely distressed as he continued. "I only learned about the tree cutting after it was already completed. She told me it was necessary for community standards, but she never mentioned it was your private property." He agreed to help me access financial records that proved Margaret had been using HOA funds inappropriately for months. More importantly, he confirmed that Margaret had forged several signatures on HOA documents and had never actually held the required community votes for most of her major decisions. "She's been running this place like her personal kingdom," he told me quietly, his voice filled with years of suppressed resentment. "I'm tired of being afraid to speak up about what I know is wrong." My second crucial ally was Linda Harrison, a 65-year-old retired court clerk who lived 3 houses down from me. Linda had been quietly documenting Margaret's abuses for 2 years, keeping meticulous records of every procedural violation and financial irregularity. "I've been waiting for someone with the knowledge and courage to challenge her," Linda confessed during a private meeting in her kitchen. "Margaret has destroyed the sense of community we once had here. People are afraid to speak up because they don't want to become her next target." Linda's documentation was extraordinary. She had copies of forged signatures, records of financial decisions made without proper approval, and evidence of Margaret using her position to benefit her personal interests. "I was a court clerk for 30 years, she explained. "I know what proper procedure looks like, and Margaret has violated almost every principle of legitimate governance." The tree removal company provided the final piece of evidence I needed. When I contacted Greenwood Tree Services directly, they were surprisingly cooperative once I explained who I was and what I was investigating. "Ma'am called us on a Tuesday morning," the company owner, Pete Wilson, explained over the phone. "Said it was an emergency situation, needed immediate tree removal for community safety reasons. She seemed to have authority, had official letterhead, and paid cash up front." Pete admitted they'd performed the $23,000 job based on Margaret's emergency authorization without properly verifying ownership documents. She said she was acting on behalf of the community association and had full authority to make landscaping decisions. "We should have checked more carefully, but she was very convincing." More importantly, Pete revealed that Margaret had paid for the entire job using what appeared to be HOA community funds, despite the work being done on private property. "She had checks from the Willowbrook Community Association account," he confirmed. "Said it was budgeted community maintenance." This was a clear violation of financial management laws governing homeowners associations. Margaret had used community money to destroy private property without obtaining required approvals from the membership. I spent that evening organizing all my evidence into a comprehensive case file: property surveys proving the trees were on my private land, environmental reports confirming violations of protected species laws, financial records showing misuse of community funds, testimony from multiple witnesses about Margaret's pattern of abuse. Sitting in my living room, looking out at the wasteland where my forest once stood, I felt a sense of calm determination settling over me. Margaret Sullivan had picked the wrong target for her power games. She thought she was dealing with some ordinary new homeowner who could be bullied into submission. She had no idea that for 15 years, I'd been the person who investigated people exactly like her and held them accountable for their crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, my allies were in place, and it was time to show Margaret what real authority looked like. 2 weeks later, Margaret organized what she announced would be the final HOA meeting to resolve the David Mitchell problem. She'd even brought in the HOA's attorney and a representative from the property management company, clearly confident that this would be her moment of ultimate victory. The community room was packed with 45 residents, many of whom had been influenced by Margaret's weeks of character assassination. She'd arranged for professional-looking presentation materials and had even set up a microphone system to ensure everyone could hear her final resolution of my problem. Before the meeting began, Margaret stood at the front of the room and declared, "Tonight, we're going to settle this once and for all. Mr. Mitchell will either accept our authority and follow our rules, or face the full legal consequences of his defiance. I sat quietly in the back row, a black leather briefcase beside me, watching Margaret bask in what she assumed would be her final triumph. She had no idea that this meeting was about to become the most humiliating experience of her life. Margaret began her presentation with absolute confidence, outlining what she called the facts of the case. She had prepared charts, graphs, and official-looking documents that painted me as a threat to community harmony. David Mitchell has consistently refused to accept legitimate HOA authority, she announced, gesturing dramatically toward me. He has threatened legal action against our community, shown contempt for our democratic decisions, and created an atmosphere of conflict in our previously peaceful neighborhood. She presented her photocopied documents, the fine notices, and various other papers as evidence of my pattern of defiance and disruption. Several residents nodded along with her narrative, clearly convinced that I was indeed the problem. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she sensed the room's support. With our attorney present tonight, I'm formally requesting that Mr. Mitchell either accept full responsibility for his violations or face immediate legal action for breach of community standards. The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement and anticipation. Margaret looked directly at me with triumph in her eyes. Mr. Mitchell, this is your final opportunity to apologize and comply. What's your decision? I stood up slowly, walked to the front of the room, and opened my briefcase. The confidence in Margaret's expression began to waver as I calmly arranged documents on the table in full view of everyone present. Before we continue, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room, I think everyone should see some actual facts about this situation. The first document I displayed was an official property survey from the County Land Records Office, clearly showing that the entire forested area fell within my private property boundaries and outside any HOA jurisdiction. Mrs. Sullivan claimed authority she never had, I explained, watching Margaret's face begin to pale. Every single tree she ordered cut down was 100% on my private land, with no HOA jurisdiction whatsoever. The second document was Michael Rodriguez's professional damage assessment, detailing $78,500 in environmental destruction and violations of state tree preservation laws. This wasn't landscape management, I continued, holding up photographs of the protected species that had been destroyed. This was the illegal destruction of protected native species without required permits, in violation of multiple environmental protection laws. The third set of documents, provided by Linda Harrison, showed clear evidence of financial mismanagement and procedural violations spanning 2 years. Mrs. Sullivan used $3,200 from community funds to pay for this illegal tree removal without membership approval and in direct violation of HOA financial regulations. Margaret's face had gone completely white as neighbors began murmuring and looking at her with confusion and growing anger, but I wasn't finished. The fourth document, I continued, is a notarized statement from James Sullivan confirming that Margaret has forged signatures on multiple HOA decisions and has never held proper votes for most of her major initiatives. James stood up in the audience, his face flushed with embarrassment but his voice steady. I can't stay silent about this anymore. My wife has been violating proper procedures for years, and I have documentation to prove it. The room was completely silent now, with all eyes moving between me, the documents, and Margaret's increasingly panicked expression. But I had saved the most important revelation for last. There's something else everyone should know about me before we continue, I said, looking around the room at the stunned faces of my neighbors. My name is David Mitchell, and for the past 15 years, I've been a federal environmental inspector specializing in natural resource violations and illegal land use. The transformation in the room was immediate and dramatic. Neighbors who had been nodding along with Margaret's accusations suddenly looked shocked and embarrassed. Margaret herself seemed to shrink visibly, her confident demeanor evaporating as the reality of her situation became clear. I've investigated hundreds of cases exactly like this one, I continued. Mrs. Sullivan didn't just violate my property rights. She violated the Environmental Protection Act, state tree preservation laws, HOA, financial management regulations, and multiple other federal and state statutes. I pulled out my federal inspector's badge and identification, which I still carried from my recent retirement. For 15 years, my job was to investigate people who illegally destroy protected environments for personal gain. Mrs. Sullivan has committed every violation I've ever seen, and several I hadn't encountered before. The silence in the room was deafening. Margaret looked like she was about to be sick, and several neighbors were staring at her with expressions of betrayal and anger. Linda Harrison was the first to stand up. "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in Margaret Sullivan as HOA president," she announced. "I've been documenting her violations of proper procedure for 2 years, and tonight's revelations are the final proof we needed." James Sullivan, sitting just 3 rows from his wife, raised his hand in support. "I second the motion. I can't protect her anymore. What she's done is wrong, and everyone deserves to know the truth." One by one, residents began standing to voice their support for removing Margaret from office. The woman who had spent weeks painting me as a troublemaker was now facing a community uprising against her own leadership. The vote, when it finally came, was devastating. 42 residents voted to remove Margaret from office, with only 3 abstentions. But Margaret wasn't finished yet. As the meeting was concluding, and she was preparing to leave in disgrace, she suddenly turned back to the room with wild desperation in her eyes. "You think you've won something here, David? You have no idea what you've just done." Her voice was shrill and frantic, all pretense of dignity abandoned. The room fell completely silent as Margaret continued her shocking confession. "That forest of yours was the last piece of property standing in the way of a $50 million resort development that I've been working on for 5 years. Gasps echoed through the room as neighbors realized what they were hearing. Margaret's voice became increasingly manic as she revealed the full scope of her deception. "I've already got City Planning Board approval, investors lined up, and Pinnacle Development Corporation ready to pay $2 million for this entire area. Those trees were just the first step in clearing the way for development." She pointed an accusatory finger at me, her face twisted with rage. "If you won't sell voluntarily, we'll find other ways to get what we need. This whole neighborhood is sitting on a gold mine, and you're too stupid to realize it." Her confession continued, becoming more damaging with every word. "You think I'm just some power-hungry HOA president? I'm a paid consultant for Pinnacle Development, and they need your land to complete their luxury resort project." The stunned silence in the room was broken by my quiet laughter. Margaret had just provided a complete confession to conspiracy, fraud, and attempted theft in front of 45 witnesses. "Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan, for that complete confession," I said calmly. "This entire meeting has been recorded, and your admission of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted theft will be very helpful in the criminal charges that are about to be filed against you." Margaret's face went white as she realized she'd just destroyed any hope of avoiding serious legal consequences. 3 months later, Margaret Sullivan found herself facing a perfect storm of legal consequences that completely destroyed her life as she'd known it. The court system moved swiftly once the evidence was presented, and Margaret was hit with multiple lawsuits simultaneously. The civil court ordered her to pay me $52,000 in damages for property destruction, legal fees, and punitive penalties. She was required to pay back $3,200 to the HOA Community Fund, plus interest and administrative penalties that brought the total to nearly $5,000. Most significantly, she faced criminal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted theft related to her relationship with Pinnacle Development Corporation. The district attorney's office was particularly interested in her confession, which had been recorded by multiple residents using their cell phones. The judge's final ruling was particularly satisfying. Margaret was permanently banned from holding any community management position for 5 years, required to complete 200 hours of community service focused on environmental restoration, and ordered to personally supervise the replanting of every single tree that had been destroyed on my property. The sight of Margaret, wearing work gloves and covered in dirt, planting oak saplings under the supervision of a court-appointed environmental specialist, was a level of justice that money couldn't buy. Every weekend, for 6 months, she was required to work on the restoration project while neighbors watched her undoing the damage she'd caused. Pinnacle Development Corporation faced their own reckoning when federal investigators discovered a pattern of bribery and illegal land acquisition schemes spanning multiple states. The luxury resort project was permanently canceled, the company's assets were frozen, and several executives joined Margaret in facing serious criminal charges. The FBI investigation revealed that Margaret had been receiving monthly payments of $3,000 for 2 years to facilitate community cooperation with the development project. Her real estate license was permanently revoked, and she was barred from working in any property-related business. Margaret and James divorced within 6 months, and both were forced to sell their house and leave the community in complete disgrace. James kept most of their assets, having cooperated fully with the investigation and providing crucial evidence against his ex-wife. Linda Harrison was unanimously elected as the new HOA president and immediately implemented sweeping reforms that transformed how the community operated. Financial transparency became mandatory, with monthly reports and member approval required for any expenditure over $500. All major decisions now required proper voting procedures with adequate notice and documentation. Linda established a resident oversight committee to prevent any future abuse of authority and created a community newsletter to keep everyone informed about HOA activities. James Sullivan, finally free from his toxic marriage, became one of my closest friends and helped design an irrigation system for the new forest restoration project. His engineering expertise proved invaluable in creating a sustainable ecosystem that would thrive for decades to come. Many other neighbors, embarrassed by how quickly they'd believed Margaret's lies about me, went out of their way to welcome me properly to the community. Frank organized a neighborhood barbecue specifically to apologize for the way I'd been treated. "We should have asked more questions," he admitted during the event. "Margaret was so confident and authoritative that we just assumed she knew what she was doing. We're sorry it took so long for the truth to come out." The sense of community that had been destroyed by Margaret's authoritarian leadership began to return stronger than ever. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak up during her reign began participating actively in community decisions. With the $52,000 in court-ordered damages, I hired a team of environmental specialists to create something far better than what had been destroyed. Instead of simply replanting the original trees, we designed a diverse ecosystem that combined native species, fruit trees, and medicinal herbs. The new forest included walking paths, benches for community use, and a small pond that attracted wildlife back to the area. I worked with local environmental groups to create educational signage that taught visitors about native plants and wildlife conservation. The transformation of my property became a symbol of environmental resilience and community healing. Neighbors frequently brought their children to walk the trails and learn about the importance of preserving natural habitats. Local schools began organizing field trips to study the restoration project, and environmental groups used my forest as an example of successful ecosystem recovery after human-caused damage. The pond became home to frogs, turtles, and various bird species that had been absent from the area for years. My reputation in the community evolved from problem resident to community protector, and neighbors regularly sought my advice on property rights issues and environmental concerns. Sarah Martinez's law firm began referring clients to me for environmental consulting, and my experience with Margaret became a case study in property rights law. 1 year after the destruction, I organized a community celebration in the restored forest to mark the anniversary and show appreciation for everyone who had supported justice over intimidation. Linda, James, and 23 neighbor families joined me for an afternoon of food, music, and environmental education among the thriving young trees. The saplings had grown to heights of 3 feet, and the ecosystem was showing remarkable signs of recovery. Birds had returned to nest in the new growth, and the pond supported a healthy population of amphibians and aquatic insects. As the celebration was winding down and families were heading home, Linda presented me with a hand-carved wooden sign that she'd commissioned from a local artisan. The sign read Mitchell's Grove, where justice prevailed, and was designed to hang at the main entrance to the forest trails. I installed it next to a young oak tree that I'd grown from an acorn, the first seed planted after winning the legal battle. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. From destruction and abuse of power, something beautiful and lasting had emerged. Standing under the canopy of young trees, looking toward the house where Margaret once lived and plotted her schemes, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond personal victory. The new family living there now, a young couple with twin daughters who loved exploring the forest trails, represented everything that Margaret's vision would have destroyed. A gentle breeze moved through the leaves of the growing trees, carrying the sounds of children playing and birds returning to make their homes in our restored ecosystem. The forest that Margaret tried to destroy for profit had become a living testament to the power of knowledge, persistence, and the courage to stand up to those who abuse their authority. Sometimes justice doesn't come quickly, but when it arrives, it can transform entire communities. And every morning when I look out my window at those thriving young trees, I'm reminded that protecting what matters most is always worth the fight, no matter how powerful your opponents might seem.